The world is dark and alive. Fire flickers against the walls of a cave, and in that trembling light, something eternal awakens. A hand rises, smeared in red ochre, pressing a mark onto stone, a declaration not of conquest, but of existence. Outside, the wind howls across endless plains, carrying the breath of countless generations not yet born. Above, the stars burn cold and indifferent, unaware that one small spark below has just changed everything. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So maybe subscribe and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Because this isn't just a story about evolution. It's about memory. About how every thought, every heartbeat, every dream you've ever had began here in the firelight of a world still half asleep. The first humans were not who we think they were. They were everyone. And their story is still burning inside us. The world is quiet before memory. A soft wind moves across the grasslands, brushing over a landscape that feels both alien and familiar. The air smells of rain and smoke. On the horizon, the sky glows with the orange breath of countless fires. Around them, silhouettes move, figures small against the endless dark. Their faces are strange, their bones thicker, their brows heavier, but their eyes carry something unmistakable: thought, wonder, the first flicker of recognition that would one day become humanity. This is a dawn older than words, older than nations, older than the idea of time itself. The earth is still raw, untamed, and pulsing with life. Rivers cut through vast plains where mammoths graze and saber-toothed cats prowl in the shadows. But at the heart of this wilderness sits something new, a fragile, trembling light. Fire. And with it, a different kind of creature has begun to awaken. They sit close to the flames, watching it dance, not with instinct, but with awareness. They are not yet human, as we know it. They are something in between, beings who can feel the line between life and death and wonder what lies beyond it. The fire changes everything. It offers warmth in a cold world, protection in the night, and light to see what was once hidden. But it also offers something more: subtle reflection. In those flames, they begin to see themselves. The shape of a hand, the shadow of a face, the realization that they are separate from the beasts that share the earth with them. This moment, this quiet contemplation by the fire, is where humanity begins, not in the body, but in the mind. Around the flickering light, murmurs rise. Not words yet, but the rhythm of language being born. A hum, a breath, a sound that carries meaning. It is the first attempt to bridge the space between one mind and another. Above them, the stars burn in the same patterns we see tonight. The same constellations, the same cosmic witnesses to every story that will ever be told. These early beings don't know what they are becoming. They have no word for future, no concept of civilization. But somewhere inside them, something stirs a spark that will one day build cities, write songs, and reach for the stars. For now, it burns quietly in the glow of a campfire, under a sky that has not yet learned to forget. And in that silence, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the first heartbeat of humanity echoing across the endless night. The story of humanity is not a straight line. It was never a steady climb from ape to man, from primitive to civilized, from darkness into light. That is the illusion we tell ourselves, the comforting myth of progress. But the truth, hidden deep in the layers of time, is far more tangled and far more extraordinary. Evolution does not move like an arrow. It drifts like a river, splitting into countless streams, doubling back on itself, flooding one valley while leaving another dry. Each branch was an experiment, each species a possibility. And for every one that survived, dozens vanished into silence. The Earth was a laboratory of life long before we appeared. Across millions of years, climates shifted, continents collided, and landscapes were reborn. With every change came new creatures that walked upright, shaped tools, or dared to look at the stars. There were the toolmakers, the wanderers, the fire keepers, each carrying fragments of the human spark. Some thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, others only for a brief moment, yet every one left something behind. A jawbone in volcanic ash, a footprint hardened in ancient mud, a tool chipped from stone and forgotten in the dirt. These were not separate stories. They were verses in the same song, the long, unpredictable rhythm of becoming human. When we imagine our lineage, we picture a single path leading straight to us, as though we were inevitable. But the truth is, we are only one of many outcomes. Once, the world was alive with different kinds of humans, each thinking, feeling, and creating in their own way. Some stood taller, some smaller. Some lived in forests, others on open plains. Some could craft fire. Others carved symbols into bone. For long ages, they existed together, crossing paths, sharing landscapes, and perhaps even sharing dreams. And then, like branches in winter, they began to fall away. The reasons are written in the Earth's restless heart: climate shifts, scarcity, storms of ice and ash. Each extinction was not an ending, but a narrowing, a pruning of the great tree of life until only a few fragile leaves remained. We are what survived. But survival does not mean superiority. It means chance. It means timing. It means that out of the many experiments nature tried, one happened to endure. When you trace the human family tree, it does not lead to a single root. It spirals into a forest of forgotten lives, each one a mirror reflecting what we might have been. And when you stand in that forest long enough, you begin to see the truth. We are not the end of evolution. We are only its latest question, still unfolding, still unfinished. Long before the world knew our name, long before words or memory, a pair of hands reached for a stone. It was a simple act, one that had been done countless times before by creatures seeking food or defense. But this time, something changed. The stone was not used as it was found. It was shaped. A smaller rock was lifted and struck against it. Once, then again, each impact sending flakes flying into the dust. In that rhythm of collision and creation, something new entered the world. Thought had become action. Instinct had become intention. The being who did this was not yet human, but the spark of humanity had just been born. This creature, later known as Homo habilis, the handy human, lived over 2 million years ago in the valleys and grasslands of Africa. They were small, no taller than a child today, but their minds held a quiet revolution. For the first time, an animal had learned to shape the world around it rather than simply endure it. Their tools were crude, just flakes of stone sharpened along the edge, but with them came power. With a single tool, a piece of bone could be cracked for marrow, a carcass stripped clean, a shelter built from branches. Survival no longer depended solely on teeth or claw. It depended on imagination. The making of tools changed everything. It was the first true expression of foresight, of planning, of cause and effect. To strike one stone against another and see not what it is, but what it could become, that is the beginning of invention. Each tool was a promise that the world could be shaped by will, and that realization rippled outward, generation after generation, carving the path toward everything that would follow. Art, language, architecture, technology. The hands that shaped stone would one day shape civilization. But the miracle of Homo habilis was not just what they made, it was what they became in the making. Tool-making demanded patience, observation, and learning. The knowledge had to be seen, copied, and remembered. For the first time, one mind began to teach another. A chain of understanding was forged, linking the living to those who would come after. Across those ancient plains, The sound of stone striking stone echoed through time, a simple rhythm that would one day build cities and send machines into the sky. And though the makers of those first tools vanished long ago, their legacy never did. Every object ever crafted, every idea ever realized, traces its origin back to that moment in the dust, when a small, curious creature held a stone in its hand and dared to imagine it could become something more. The first true conquerors of darkness were not kings or warriors but wanderers with fire in their hands. They were called Homo erectus, and they walked the earth nearly 2 million years ago. Taller, stronger, and more enduring than their ancestors, they were built for distance, for discovery, for patience in a world still wild and merciless. But what set them apart was not their stride. It was what they carried, something fragile, flickering, and alive. Fire. In the vast grasslands of Africa, lightning split the sky and struck the dry savanna. The flames spread, roaring through the tall grass, consuming everything in their path. Most creatures fled, but somewhere on the edge of the inferno, a small band stayed behind. They waited until the flames burned low, until only glowing embers remained. Then, with care, they gathered the coals, feeding them with dry leaves, shielding them from the wind. It was the beginning of mastery over nature's most dangerous force. With fire came a revolution that no weapon could match. It offered warmth against the cold, protection from predators, and light to drive back the night. For the first time, the darkness lost its dominion. The circle of firelight became a sanctuary, a place where fear was replaced by reflection. The world no longer ended at sunset. It expanded into the night. But fire gave more than safety. It transformed the very essence of life. Meat roasted in the flame became easier to chew, easier to digest. The body absorbed more energy, the brain grew larger, and with that, thought deepened. Fire also shaped time itself. Days grew longer. Around the embers, they lingered, staring into the glow, sharing sounds that would one day become words. In that quiet communion, the first sense of community was born. As the generations passed, these keepers of fire began to travel farther than any species before them. From Africa to the Middle East, from Asia to the islands beyond, they followed rivers and coastlines, carrying with them the memory of flame. Some learned to make it from scratch, others to preserve it through endless journeys, guarding it as if it were a living spirit. Wherever firelight burned, humanity followed. Homo erectus was the first creature to look into the night and not feel helpless. Beneath the same stars that watch over us now, they claimed their place in a world that had never belonged to them before. And in that fragile glow of flame, something eternal was set alight, the spark of mastery, the promise that one day, light would not just illuminate the darkness, but define it. Long before our kind took its first steps, others had already begun the great journey. They were the wanderers of the earth, early humans who looked to the horizon not with fear, but with quiet purpose. Long before maps, borders, or nations, they walked out of Africa and into the unknown. Their names are lost, their bones scattered across forgotten valleys, but their footprints mark the beginning of humanity's most enduring instinct, the need to explore. The world they faced was vast and unforgiving. Across the open plains of Africa, the air shimmered with heat. Beyond lay deserts that stretched for weeks without water, mountains crowned with ice, and forests filled with unseen dangers. Yet something within them kept pushing forward. They followed rivers that twisted like silver veins through the land, trailed herds across endless grasslands, and crossed into lands no creature like them had ever seen before. It was not a conquest. It was survival. The earth was their teacher, and movement was their faith. These early travelers were likely Homo erectus, the first to venture beyond their birthplace. Their migrations were not brief or sudden, they unfolded over tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation moved slowly, guided by hunger, curiosity, and climate. Some followed the coastlines into Arabia, where the wind carried the scent of salt and the sea. Others wandered north, through valleys carved by glaciers, into the heart of Asia. Wherever they went, they adapted. They learned to live in the heat of the savanna, the chill of high mountains, and the damp forests that swallowed light. Their journey reshaped them in ways invisible yet profound. Bodies grew stronger, minds grew sharper. Fire went with them, a small, flickering ember linking one camp to the next. The rhythm of walking, of constant movement, became part of who they were. And though they could not have known it, every step they took prepared the path for those who would follow the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and eventually us. For nearly 2 million years, this wandering spirit would define the human story. It carried our ancestors to the farthest edges of the world and across oceans that seemed endless. It filled caves with art, deserts with footprints, and the air with the first songs of survival. When we look up today and wonder what lies beyond the next horizon, that impulse is not new. It is ancient. It lives in the same pulse that once drove a small band of early humans to leave the cradle of Africa and walk toward forever. They did not know what waited for them, only that something within them refused to stand still. In the cold heart of the Ice Age, when glaciers pressed down upon Europe and the wind sang through endless valleys of frost, another kind of human thrived. They were the Neanderthals, the northern bloodline, broad-shouldered, powerful, and deeply adapted to the world of ice and stone. For more than 300,000 years, they ruled the western lands of the ancient world, surviving in conditions that would break most modern humans within days. Their story is not one of primitive struggle, but of mastery, resilience, and quiet brilliance. In caves carved by time and rivers, they built their homes from bone, hide, and mammoth tusk. Fires burned low to keep the cold at bay, their glow dancing across walls that bore the marks of life and art. These people were not beasts of instinct. They were thinkers, creators, mourners. In the frozen soil of Europe, archaeologists have found graves carefully dug, bodies placed with flowers and tools. They buried their dead not by accident, but with meaning. Somewhere in that act lay the first whispers of belief, the idea that life might not end with death. Their hands were strong, skilled, and deliberate. They shaped tools from flint, sharper than any blade, and carved delicate flutes from bird bones, capable of carrying haunting melodies across the tundra. The same hands that hunted mammoths could also create music. It was proof that intelligence and emotion had already intertwined long before our arrival. For generations, they endured. When ice sheets advanced, they moved with the herds, building temporary shelters and tracking the seasons with the precision of scientists. They read the stars, understood the tides, and learned the movements of the great animals that shared their world. Their eyes saw color and beauty in a landscape most would call empty. To them, the frozen valleys were not hostile. They were home. And yet, despite their strength, the Neanderthals would one day vanish. Not because they were weaker, not because they were less intelligent, but because the world shifted, and another species, our own, arrived. The two would meet, mix, and share more than conflict. They would share blood. To this day, traces of Neanderthal DNA flow quietly within us, a genetic echo of the North. The Neanderthals were not the missing link. They were a chapter of humanity in full, one that loved, built, dreamed, and endured. When you look into the fire and see the reflection of your own eyes, remember, somewhere in that flame is their gaze too, steady and ancient, watching the world they helped to build. High in the mountains of the east, where clouds cling to stone and breath turns thin and heavy, another kind of human once walked. They lived among peaks that touched the edge of the sky, a world of silence and shadow where only the strong could endure. These were the Denisovans, an ancient people whose faces have vanished from time, yet whose presence still lingers inside us, written quietly into the language of our blood. The world they inhabited was one of extremes. Vast ranges of ice and rock cut through Asia, their valleys echoing with the cries of wind and water. To survive here required more than strength. It required adaptation of body and mind. The air was thin, the nights brutal, the seasons unpredictable. Yet the Denisovans flourished where others could not. They made tools with precision, hunted the highland beasts, and kindled fire in caves carved by glacier and time. These caves became sanctuaries, warm, flickering pockets of life in a land of cold eternity. Little of them remains. No full skeletons, no faces to look upon. Only fragments of tooth, a finger bone, and traces of their DNA hidden within our own. But these remnants are enough to reveal their power. They were not wanderers of the plains or dwellers of the coast. They were the people of altitude, a lineage built for thin air and frozen earth. Modern humans who live in the high Himalayas or the Tibetan Plateau still carry the legacy of their endurance. The ability to breathe and thrive where oxygen fades comes from genes passed down by these mountain ancestors. They were part of the great human mosaic, living alongside Neanderthals and the first Homo sapiens, sometimes meeting, sometimes merging, shaping the future in ways unseen. In their silent heights, they forged connections that would ripple across the generations. When we look at the diversity of humankind today, our colors, our features, our differences, it is their inheritance we are seeing, the genetic fingerprints of a forgotten people who once looked out from the roof of the world. The Denisovans remind us that history is not only what is visible. Some stories survive not in bones or artifacts, but in the quiet rhythm of breathing, in the heartbeat that adjusts to altitude, in the resilience that still defines our species. Though their faces are lost to time, they are not gone. They live on in every gasp of thin mountain air, in every heartbeat that endures where others would fade. The mountains still remember them, and somewhere within us, so do we. Far out in the southern seas, beyond the sight of any mainland, lies an island that once held a secret world. Its forests were thick with the cries of birds and the footsteps of giants. Here, evolution wrote a strange and beautiful story, one of small hands, great courage, and a species that defied the limits of size and survival. This was the home of Homo floresiensis, known to us as the hobbits of human history. They stood barely over a meter tall, with skulls no larger than a grapefruit. Yet within those tiny frames lived a fire as ancient as any that ever burned. On the island of Flores, everything was exaggerated. Massive lizards hunted across riverbanks, descendants of the dragons we now call Komodo. Elephants had shrunk to the size of ponies, victims of nature's rule that, in isolation, the great become small and the small become great. Cut off from the rest of the world, species evolved along their own strange paths, shaped by scarcity and solitude. And among them, these little humans thrived, mastering the art of survival on an island that belonged to predators far larger than themselves. They built fires in the shadows of cliffs and crafted tools from volcanic stone. Sharp-edged flakes, simple yet effective, lay scattered beside the bones of prey. Theirs was a life of constant vigilance, where one wrong step could end in the jaws of a dragon. Yet they endured for thousands upon thousands of years, long after other ancient humans had vanished. They hunted, gathered, and adapted with an intelligence that far outshone their size. To look upon them would have been to see contradiction itself, childlike faces, but ancient eyes. They were not myths or malformed descendants. They were another branch of humanity's vast experiment, proof that the human spark could burn in many shapes. The discovery of their remains on Flores stunned the world because it forced us to confront an unsettling truth. We were not the only humans to walk this earth, and perhaps not even the strangest. Homo floresiensis is a reminder that evolution favors no single form. Intelligence and survival do not belong to size or strength, but to adaptability and imagination. On that isolated island, surrounded by roaring seas and towering beasts, these small giants carved their own destiny. Their fires burned quietly, unseen by the rest of the world. Yet their existence expands the meaning of what it is to be human. The island has long gone silent, its inhabitants gone to dust, but the memory remains proof that even in the smallest of forms, greatness once walked the earth. Across the ancient plains of the east, where rivers braided through forests of cypress and mist, another kind of human rose. They were the giants of the riverlands, towering and strong, a lineage built from patience and endurance. Their bones tell a story of power, but their skulls whisper of something deeper, a quiet intelligence, an awareness that reached beyond mere survival. These were the humans who lived in the lands of the rising sun, long before our species arrived to claim its place in history. The rivers of ancient China carried more than water. They carried life. They wound through fertile valleys teeming with elephants, rhinos, and giant deer. The air was heavy with warmth, and the earth was rich with promise. It was here that a new form of humanity took shape. Their faces were broad, their brows strong, and their limbs thick with muscle. They were not the frail wanderers of the savannah. They were builders of endurance, molded by a land that demanded both strength and intelligence. When their fossilized remains were discovered, massive skulls with deep eye sockets and pronounced ridges, they seemed almost mythic, as if carved by the earth itself. Scientists would later call them Homo longi, the dragon people, though no one truly knows what they called themselves. What is clear is that they were not primitive. Their skulls housed large brains, their hands could craft tools with precision, and their existence overlapped with both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. In the East, while Europe was ruled by ice and stone, the riverlands nurtured a different kind of evolution. These ancient giants lived in a world where survival required foresight. The great rivers, ancestors of the Yangtze and Yellow, flooded and receded with the rhythm of the seasons, forcing adaptation and planning. Fire flickered along the banks, a testament to their command of the elements. They hunted the plains, gathered roots and berries, and perhaps built shelters along the fertile deltas. Yet it was their silence that defined them. They left few marks of art or burial, no painted caves or carved symbols. Their wisdom was practical, their legacy written not in culture, but in blood. Because their story did not end with extinction, the genes of these riverland humans flowed quietly into others. When Homo sapiens spread eastward, they met the descendants of these giants. And once again, humanity did what it always had: merged, mingled, remembered. Deep in the DNA of modern Asians lie traces of this ancient lineage, an invisible inheritance from beings whose bodies vanished, but whose spirit endures through us. Their existence reshapes the map of human origins. For centuries, we believed that the story of humankind began and radiated solely from Africa, but these riverland giants remind us that evolution was not a single spark, but a constellation. Different fires burning in different corners of the world, sometimes meeting, sometimes fading, each shaping the next. When the mists rise over the ancient valleys of China and sunlight glimmers on the rivers below, it is easy to imagine them still there, broad-shouldered silhouettes moving through the morning haze, eyes reflecting the first light of day. They were not our ancestors in the strictest sense, but they were part of us in a greater one. Every pulse of human history carries echoes of their strength. They were the quiet giants of the East, watching the dawn break over a world still young, their wisdom unspoken, their legacy written in the flow of every living vein. In their reflection, we see not strangers, but another version of ourselves shaped by different lands, yet reaching for the same light. Deep beneath the red soil of Africa lies the memory of countless lives that time has forgotten. Fossils buried in riverbeds, fragments sealed in ancient stone, whispers of species that rose, adapted, and vanished long before the world ever spoke the name Homo sapiens. This continent, the cradle of every dream that would ever walk upright, holds within it not one origin story, but many. Each fossil unearthed is a sentence in an unfinished book, a reminder that our story did not begin in a single spark, but in a storm of creation and extinction. The early Earth was a place of constant change. Forests turned to grasslands, rivers shifted course, and climates swung between drought and flood. In this unpredictable land, evolution became an artist with endless brushes. Across millions of years, one lineage after another experimented with form and mind. There was Homo naledi, small-bodied and deep-thinking, who carried their dead into caves lit only by torchlight. There was Homo rudolfensis, with broad faces and curious hands. There was Homo ergaster, a master of endurance, built for distance and heat, and countless others ancestors we may never name, each a branch on the tree that would one day bear us. Many of these species lived side by side, their paths overlapping across the same valleys and savannas. Africa was not a single cradle, but a continent-wide laboratory of humanity. Some thrived in the humid forests of the Congo Basin, others roamed the open plains of the Rift Valley, following herds beneath skies that burned gold at dusk. There was no one direction for evolution to follow, no clear progression from primitive to modern. Instead, there was diversity, a web of beings experimenting with survival. Some developed better tools, others more complex social bonds. Some vanished quietly into the dust, leaving behind only teeth and bones. But together, they carried the torch of becoming human, passing it forward again and again. When we look into our own DNA, we still find traces of them, ghost signatures of ancient unions that shaped who we are. Their genes linger in our metabolism, our immune systems, even in the architecture of our minds. They are not gone. They simply changed form, merging into the bloodstream of time until their stories became indistinguishable from our own. Every discovery beneath the African earth reveals how incomplete our picture has been. The ground itself is layered with mystery, waiting to tell us that we are not the culmination of a single species, but the sum of many forgotten ones. Each one added something vital to the great experiment: intelligence, cooperation, endurance, empathy. Together, they made the impossible possible. They made us. So when the wind moves across the grasslands of East Africa, or when rain darkens the ancient soil of Olduvai Gorge, it carries the breath of millions who came before. The hidden ancestors still speak, not in words, but in every heartbeat, in every thought, in every spark of imagination that separates us from the dark. We are their echo. And through us, their story continues, endlessly branching, endlessly becoming. From the restless heart of Africa, beneath skies alive with lightning and thunder, a new kind of being emerged. It did not happen in an instant or a miracle, but through countless generations of change, loss, and adaptation. From grass and storm, from hunger and flame, a face began to appear, a face we would one day call our own. This was the birth of Homo sapiens. Not a creation from nothing, but the continuation of everything that came before. Around 300,000 years ago, the African landscape was shifting once again. Vast grasslands stretched where forests once stood, and the rhythms of life demanded new responses. The old ways of survival were no longer enough. The beings who rose during this time carried within them the legacy of all their ancestors: the tool-making of Homo habilis, the endurance of Homo erectus, the curiosity of those forgotten lineages who had tested the limits of what it meant to be human. But now something new was awakening, something invisible but unmistakable. Consciousness. Their bodies were familiar. Tall, slender, built for distance and heat. Their hands, delicate yet capable, could shape tools with precision beyond anything seen before. Their minds, however, were where the transformation truly began. They looked at the world not only as it was, but as it could be. They began to imagine outcomes, to plan, to hope. They created tools of bone and stone, ornaments carved from ivory, pigments scraped from the earth to mark skin or rock. For the first time, creation was not only survival, it was expression. This was not a single tribe or a single moment, but a slow, quiet revolution spread across the African plains. From the north to the south, different populations of early Homo sapiens lived, evolved, and mixed. Over tens of thousands of years, they shared fire, tools, and perhaps even stories. What united them was not geography, but a growing awareness of self. They had begun to understand the difference between what they were and what they could become. When they gazed into water, they recognized the reflection not as another creature but as themselves. That simple act of recognition, of identity, marked a threshold no other species had crossed so completely. It was the dawn of imagination, of art, of memory. In their eyes, we see the beginnings of fear, wonder, and longing. They buried their dead with care, painted the first symbols on stone, and began to dream beyond the horizon. Homo sapiens were not born to dominate, but to question. Every discovery brought new challenges. Every answer opened more mysteries. They did not conquer the earth through strength, but through curiosity, the ability to adapt, to communicate, and to envision. Each storm, each drought, each hunt shaped them, sharpening both mind and heart. They became wanderers, thinkers, storytellers, bearers of light in a world still half-shadowed by the ancient species that came before. From the wind-swept plains of Africa, they looked outward, not knowing what awaited them beyond the distant mountains. But something inside whispered that the journey was far from over. The first humans stood beneath the stars, faces illuminated by firelight, and in that glow, evolution itself seemed to pause, as if recognizing what it had created. Not perfection, not completion, but possibility. They were not the end of the story. They were its next chapter. The unnamed had finally found a voice, and through that voice, the world would never be the same again. The moment came when the world was no longer enough for them. The valleys that had raised them, the rivers that had fed them, the plains that had echoed with their voices for hundreds of thousands of years, all began to whisper of something beyond. The horizon called, and so began the greatest journey in the history of life on Earth, the march beyond home. It started in Africa, somewhere between the green coasts of the east and the wide deserts of the north. The earth was shifting again, its climate restless and unpredictable. Seasons lengthened, rains withdrew, and herds that once passed through in abundance began to move farther and farther away. To follow them was to live. To stay was to vanish. And so, small groups of Homo sapiens began to leave the only home their species had ever known. They did not know they were stepping into history. They simply followed hunger, curiosity, and the pull of survival. They crossed through narrow valleys carved by ancient rivers, through dry plains that shimmered with heat. Eventually, they reached the Sinai Peninsula, a gateway between worlds. From there, they entered the vast expanse of Eurasia, into lands already shaped by the lives of others. For the world they found was not empty. Across the mountains and forests lived the Neanderthals, keepers of the cold. In the east, high among the plateaus, the Denisovans watched from their mountain shelters. Humanity, it seemed, had already filled the earth long before modern humans arrived. But these newcomers brought something unfamiliar, an adaptability that bordered on restlessness. They learned quickly. They crafted tools from the stone of each new land, hunted strange animals, and found ways to endure climates no species like theirs had ever faced. In the shifting glow of firelight, they may have seen the eyes of others watching from the dark, different, yet eerily familiar. Encounters came not with conquest, but with contact. Between these groups, there was curiosity, caution, and perhaps even kinship. Their bloodlines would one day merge, leaving a shared legacy written within our genes. Over generations, their migration became a tide that could not be stopped. They followed the curve of the coasts, gathering shellfish and fish where rivers met the sea. They crossed mountains, forests, and frozen tundras. Each step carried them farther from the cradle that had shaped them and closer to the edges of the world. Some wandered north into Europe's frozen valleys. Others ventured east toward the Pacific, where the sun rose on lands no human had ever seen. Everywhere they went, the world responded. Forests were cleared for fire. Animals watched and learned, and landscapes began to bear the faint fingerprints of a thinking species. Humanity was spreading, but not like a conqueror. They moved as part of nature, not yet apart from it. For every mile they walked, they were still bound to the rhythm of the earth, the scent of rain, the flicker of flame, the pull of the stars. The march beyond home was not a single journey, but a pulse that continued for thousands of years. It would carry their descendants across continents, over mountains, and through ice. It would lead to Australia, to the frozen edges of Siberia, and one day across oceans that seemed endless. But the heart of that journey began here, with a small band of wanderers standing on the threshold of the unknown. The world was vast, alive, and waiting. And though they could not have known it, every step they took away from Africa was a step toward us, the scattered heirs of their courage, still answering the same ancient call to see what lies beyond the horizon. The world was already old when they met. Across mountains, valleys, and seas, humanity had split into many forms, each shaped by its own landscape and struggle. In the cold forests of Europe lived the Neanderthals, masters of endurance. In the high mountains of Asia, the Denisovans breathed the thin air and called the clouds home. Far to the south, the island dwellers had learned to live in isolation, their fires glowing quietly in the dark. And then came the wanderers, modern humans, emerging from Africa with the patience of rivers and the curiosity of stars. Their paths converged in a meeting that would forever change the course of evolution. It was not conquest that followed, but connection. Flesh remembered flesh. The recognition of something deeply familiar passed between them. Though separated by hundreds of thousands of years of divergence, they shared the same spark that had once ignited in the heart of Africa. When they looked at one another, they saw difference, but also reflection. They were kin divided by time, now reunited by chance. For generations, these encounters repeated across continents. In Europe, Neanderthals and modern humans walked the same valleys, hunted the same herds, and sheltered beneath the same cliffs. In Asia, Denisovans met the travelers who crossed the steppes and riverlands. On islands and coasts, other forgotten species mingled with the newcomers who brought tools, language, and the knowledge of fire. Each meeting carried both mystery and meaning. They were not always peaceful, they were not always gentle, but they were always human. The evidence of these unions is written not in stone, but in us. Every modern person alive today carries traces of ancient bloodlines, echoes of Neanderthal strength, Denisovan endurance, and perhaps even older, hidden ancestors lost to time. The genetic record reveals what history could not, that our species was never pure, never singular. It was woven from many threads, each one adding resilience, intelligence, and complexity to what we would become. The human story is not one of replacement, but of merging, of evolution through connection. These exchanges were more than biology. They were the first blending of ideas, instincts, and memories. Knowledge passed silently from one lineage to another: how to survive the cold, how to find water, how to read the patterns of the sky. And somewhere in those encounters, something profound occurred. Empathy, the ability to see oneself in the other, to imagine another's mind, to recognize, even in difference, a shared existence. Long after the species that once walked beside us vanished, their gifts endured. Our immune systems, our physical endurance, even the structure of our minds bear their mark. The Neanderthals gave us strength to survive the cold. The Denisovans gave us the ability to thrive in high altitudes. The unnamed ancestors of Africa gave us the diversity and adaptability that define our kind. The meeting of bloodlines was not the end of those other humans. It was their continuation. Through us, they still breathe, still think, still dream. Every heartbeat carries the rhythm of their survival. Every breath is shared with them, the unseen multitude that shaped what we call humanity. When the wanderers met the mountain dwellers, when the island kin touched the hands of travelers from faraway lands, the earth itself changed. No longer a world of separate species, it became a single living network of memory. And though their fires have long gone cold, their legacy burns in our veins, proof that the path of evolution was not a ladder, but a meeting place. On the quiet plains where ancient winds swept through tall grass and firelight flickered beneath the stars, something extraordinary began to unfold. The world, once divided by distance and species, was blending. Across mountains, forests, and open steppe, children were being born who carried the memory of many kinds, the living embodiment of 1,000,000 years of evolution reaching for the same light. These were not the offspring of conquest, but of convergence, the merging of souls. For hundreds of thousands of years, Earth had been home to many versions of humanity. The Neanderthals had mastered the ice. The Denisovans had made the highlands their realm. And early Homo sapiens had inherited the plains. Each lineage had adapted to its own world, shaped by its own storms, its own rhythm of survival. But when their paths crossed, the boundaries that separated them began to dissolve. Flesh met flesh. Mind met mind. And through these unions, something entirely new was born. The children of this merging were bridges between worlds. In their bones flowed the strength of Neanderthals, the lungs of Denisovans, and the imagination of Homo sapiens. They were not mutations, but harmonies, each one carrying within them the story of every human that had ever been. Nature, in its infinite patience, had not chosen one lineage over another. It had woven them together. This intermingling was not a single moment, but a slow, quiet current that flowed across continents for thousands of years. It happened in small gatherings, in shared hunts, in fireside exchanges of knowledge and survival. Different species of humans learned from one another, teaching new ways to live and adapt. The exchange was not just genetic, it was cultural, spiritual, and intellectual. In these encounters, the human mind deepened. Language grew richer. Memory stretched farther. And a collective consciousness began to take shape. The merging of souls marked a turning point in the history of life. It proved that evolution did not favor isolation but cooperation, not purity but connection. Where once there were separate branches, there was now a living network. The descendants of these meetings spread across the globe, their blood carrying the secrets of many ancestors. Every human alive today is a mosaic of those ancient unions, a living archive of forgotten lives that refuse to remain separate. The proof lies not only in DNA but in the way we experience the world. Our capacity for empathy, our longing for connection, our ability to imagine beyond ourselves, all of it may be the echo of those first mergings. When two species looked into each other's eyes and saw not threat but recognition, humanity as we know it was born. Even now, deep within our cells, the voices of our ancestors speak. Their genes shape how we breathe, how we heal, how we adapt to mountains and cold. Their memories linger in our instincts, in our fascination with the unknown, in our unending search for belonging. The merging of souls was not just the blending of bloodlines. It was the union of histories, dreams, and possibilities. In those ancient plains, where the stars stretched endlessly overhead, the earth itself seemed to pause. The children born of many kinds carried within them the pulse of all creation. They were the answer to a question the planet had been asking since life began. What happens when unity is born from diversity? The answer still beats within us. We are the proof that connection, not separation, is nature's greatest masterpiece. There came a time when the earth began to grow quiet. The valleys that once echoed with the footsteps of many kinds of humans, wanderers, builders, dreamers, fell still. One by one, the fires that had burned across continents dimmed, until only a few remained. The others did not fall by sword or slaughter, but by something gentler and more inevitable: time. They vanished, not through conquest, but through merging, through fading into the long twilight of our becoming. For hundreds of thousands of years, the planet had been a shared home to multiple species of human. The Neanderthals roamed the forests and icy plains of Europe. The Denisovans called the mountains of Asia their kingdom. On distant islands, small-bodied kin built fires under alien constellations. Each species had its mastery, its knowledge of the land, its own quiet genius. For a while, the earth was alive with diversity, many kinds of humanity thriving in parallel, each writing its story into the soil. But as the ages turned, that chorus began to fade. The reasons were as complex as life itself. The climate shifted. Ice returned, then retreated. Forests turned to grasslands. Rivers dried. Seas rose. For the Neanderthals, who had adapted to cold, the warming world brought hunger. Game grew scarce, landscapes transformed, and small groups grew isolated. The Denisovans faced a similar fate. As the glaciers melted and weather patterns changed, their mountain strongholds became less forgiving. Even the island dwellers, so well adapted to their remote homes, found themselves trapped when sea levels rose, cutting them off from the world. But extinction did not always mean disappearance. As Homo sapiens spread across continents, they carried with them the memory of those who came before, not in words, but in blood. They intermingled with Neanderthals in the valleys of Europe, with Denisovans in the highlands of Asia, and with unnamed ancestors deep within Africa's forests. Their genes became threads woven into our own. The others did not die out entirely. They became part of us. When we look into the mirror, we see fragments of them looking back. Still, the loss was immense. With every species that vanished, a library of knowledge closed forever. The ways of the ice hunters, the mountain climbers, the deep forest dwellers, entire ways of seeing and surviving, were lost to time. The world grew quieter, more singular. For the first time in Earth's history, only one kind of human walked beneath the stars. The great tree of humanity, once full of branches, had narrowed to a single stem, and yet, this was not an ending but a transformation. Those quiet extinctions were the price of unity, the merging of many voices into one song. We carry within us the last sparks of their fires, their strength, their wisdom, their capacity to adapt. Our ability to survive in the cold, to endure the thin air of mountains, to persist through famine and storm, these are their gifts. Their extinction was not a silence, but an inheritance. When night falls and you watch the flicker of a campfire, you are seeing what they once saw. You are hearing the same wind they once listened to. The quiet extinctions were not erasures. They were transformations, the moment when many worlds became one. Their bodies may have vanished, but their spirit did not. It burns in us still, carried in every heartbeat, in every breath drawn beneath the ancient sky. Through us, they continue. Through us, their story never truly ended. Long before written words, before cities and gods and empires, there was firelight. In the deep silence of prehistoric nights, within the echoing chambers of stone, humanity learned to dream aloud. Flames danced across uneven cave walls, and in that trembling light, something miraculous occurred. Hands reached out, not to hunt, not to build, but to create. Red ochre was ground from earth, bone dust mixed with ash, and the first images began to appear: lines, shapes, forms that had never existed before. It was the moment imagination stepped into the world. The birth of story began not with speech, but with vision. Long before language could capture the world, pigment could. Across Africa, Europe, and Asia, caves became sanctuaries of memory. On the walls of Lascaux and Altamira, in the rock shelters of Blombos and Sulawesi, early humans painted what they saw and what they feared. Herds of bison thundering across plains, horses and mammoths drawn in motion, mysterious handprints pressed against the stone, as if to say, "I was here." These were not decorations. They were declarations, the first attempts to preserve the fleeting world. Each line carried intention. The artists used the curves of the rock to give movement to their subjects, letting shadows turn still forms into life. They mixed minerals and charcoal with spit and fat, breathing color into existence. Every stroke was guided by more than instinct. It was awareness. For the first time, humans were not just reacting to nature, they were reflecting on it. They had learned to imagine something beyond the present moment. They could see in their minds what was not before their eyes, and in that ability lay the seed of all future civilization. Around these fires, the first storytellers were born. Perhaps they gestured toward the painted beasts as they spoke, explaining the hunt, honoring the animal, or warning of danger. But beyond survival, these stories offered something deeper: meaning. They transformed existence into narrative, turning the chaos of life into patterns of understanding. The human mind, once occupied only with fear and hunger, began to wander into new territory, the realm of myth, memory, and hope. The creation of art and story changed the very structure of the brain. It strengthened imagination, empathy, and communication. It allowed people to share not just information, but experience. Through story, one person could live inside another's world. The tribe became more than a group of survivors, it became a community of minds. Culture was born. This was the dawn of symbolism, the foundation on which everything else would be built. Music, religion, and language all trace their roots to that moment when a hand left its mark in pigment on stone. It was not merely art. It was proof of awareness, the realization that existence could be recorded, that memory could outlive flesh. The first dreams captured in red and black were the ancestors of every book, every film, every whispered tale told by firelight today. As the flames flickered across the painted walls, the shadows seemed to move. The ancient hunters came alive, running forever through the cave's dark heart. And in that illusion of motion, humanity glimpsed its own power. To make time stand still, to bring the past into the present, and to imagine a future that did not yet exist. The birth of story was the birth of us. It was how we began to understand the world, how we learned to remember, and how we learned to hope. Long after the last artist's hand faded from the stone, their message endures. Beneath every word ever written lies the same pulse of red ochre and firelight. The eternal desire to tell the world that we were here, and that our dreams mattered. There was a time when the human voice was nothing more than breath and sound, a cry of fear, a call of warning, a whisper of longing. But somewhere along the winding path of evolution, those sounds began to change. They started to carry meaning, to form patterns, to bridge the invisible space between minds. From that moment, the world transformed. Sound became symbol, and thought became shared. The invention of speech was not simply a tool for survival. It was the birth of connection, of memory, and of humanity itself. The origins of language are hidden in the fog of prehistory, but traces of its birth are etched into our anatomy. Our ancestors' faces began to change. The jaw shortened, the tongue became more agile, the larynx descended, and the brain expanded to handle the growing complexity of sound. Every adaptation refined the human voice, turning grunts and gestures into the foundation of speech. With each generation, the mouth learned to shape air into meaning, and meaning into power. At first, language must have been simple. A few shared sounds for danger, for food, for home. But those primitive calls were the roots of something far greater. Once humans discovered that sounds could represent not just objects, but actions and ideas, their world grew infinitely larger. Language allowed them to name things, to give shape to the unseen. With a word, they could capture the essence of the hunt, the sorrow of death, or the joy of birth. Words became the containers of experience, the vessels that carried emotion across time. Around the fire, language deepened. Storytelling became possible not just through gesture or painting, but through words woven together into memory. The spoken voice carried lessons, myths, and dreams, preserving them long after their speakers were gone. Through speech, ideas could outlive the body. A mother could pass wisdom to her child. A hunter could describe the shape of prey to one who had never seen it. A people could share the knowledge of generations, storing it not in stone, but in sound. Language also changed how humans thought. With words came abstraction. The mind could now imagine what was not present, could plan for the future, could question the past. It allowed for cooperation on a scale no species had ever achieved. Groups could coordinate hunts, divide labor, and form complex social bonds. But beyond strategy, language created empathy. It gave the ability to express fear, gratitude, sorrow, and love, and to understand those feelings in others. The rhythm of speech became the rhythm of civilization. It was the first great invention that belonged to everyone, shaping the rise of culture, religion, and art. Every word spoken today carries the weight of that ancient miracle. It is the echo of the first voice that dared to transform noise into meaning. Even now, when we speak, we participate in that same act of creation. Every story, every conversation, every whispered confession is a continuation of that first attempt to make thought audible. Language binds us to our ancestors, to one another, and to the future. It is how we remember, how we dream, how we survive. The invention of speech was the moment humanity learned to share its soul. Words turned isolation into understanding, and silence into song. In the breath between two voices lies the essence of what makes us human, the ability to speak, to be heard, and to be remembered. Night falls on a world still wild and young. Across open plains and deep forests, the fire crackles, the same fire that once frightened early humans now burns as their companion. Around it, the air hums with quiet voices, and the first storytellers are born. Their faces glow in the shifting light as they speak of things unseen, of spirits in the wind, of ancestors among the stars, of beasts that walk through dreams. In that fragile circle of warmth and flame, humanity discovers something far greater than survival. They discover faith. It begins with wonder. The world is vast and mysterious, filled with forces that cannot be seen or touched, but are always felt: the rumble of thunder, the return of the rains, the stillness before dawn. To early humans, these moments are not random. They are alive. Firelight flickers on stone walls, and shadows seem to move with purpose. The stars above no longer belong to the cold void of the sky. They become eyes watching, signs speaking. Every spark, every gust of wind, every birth and death feels like part of a vast and living pattern. From that awareness, belief takes shape. The first prayers are not spoken with words but felt in silence, a glance toward the heavens, a gesture of gratitude to the earth, a breath shared with the flame. Fire itself becomes sacred, the symbol of transformation and protection. It is light born from darkness, warmth carved from chaos. Around it, communities form and find rhythm. Fire keeps the predators away, but it also calls people together. It becomes the first altar, the heart of human gathering, where fear turns into reflection and reflection turns into story. As speech evolves, faith deepens. Words give form to the invisible. The storyteller becomes a bridge between the seen and the unseen, carrying the tribe beyond the immediate into the eternal. Myths emerge from the sparks' tales of how the sun was lit, how death began, why the stars move. These stories are not entertainment. They are explanations, ways to make sense of a world both beautiful and terrifying. Through them, early humans learned to see meaning in suffering, purpose in struggle, and continuity in death. Faith becomes a mirror of the human condition. It binds communities with shared hope and shared fear. It offers guidance in times of famine, comfort in loss, and courage in the face of the unknown. The first rituals arise. Hands raised toward the dawn, food left as offering to unseen spirits, songs carried into the wind. Through ritual, they rehearse survival, but also connection. They begin to believe that their lives matter to something beyond themselves. As generations pass, these beliefs evolve into the foundation of culture. Fire and faith become inseparable. One the symbol of light, the other of meaning. Together, they mark the transition from instinct to introspection. The universe, once indifferent, becomes a conversation partner. Humanity no longer feels alone beneath the stars. The night that once brought fear now brings communion. The stars overhead are no longer distant fires, but reminders. They whisper that there is order in the chaos, that perhaps the universe does listen, that perhaps creation itself is aware of the small, flickering minds that gaze upward. And so, around the fire, faith is born not as doctrine, but as wonder. In that moment, humanity becomes more than flesh and thought. It becomes a soul reaching outward, lighting the darkness not just to see, but to be seen. There was a moment in the long arc of human becoming when awareness turned inward. The same minds that once only watched the hunt, the river, and the changing of the seasons, began to ask questions that had no simple answers. What is this spark inside me that feels, that remembers, that dreams? What happens when the fire within the body fades? From pattern and wonder, from rhythm and grief, consciousness bloomed. The awakening of the mind was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, like dawn breaking over a silent landscape. The human brain had been growing for millions of years, shaped by survival. But now, it was shaping something new, imagination. Memory allowed people to look back, but imagination let them look beyond. They began to see meaning in repetition. The return of rain after drought, the phases of the moon, the migration of animals, the heartbeat of nature itself. Patterns became prophecy, and prophecy became purpose. In this rhythm of observation, a new kind of thinking took root. Abstract thought, the ability to connect what was seen with what could only be felt. In that dawning awareness, emotions deepened. Grief was no longer just absence, it was the birth of longing. When the dead no longer moved, their memory remained. Humans began to wonder if something of the person still lingered in the wind, in the fire, in the stars. The idea of the soul emerged an unseen continuation of being. From that realization came reverence. The first gods were not rulers of heaven, but reflections of experience, thunder that felt like anger, wind that whispered like breath, rivers that seemed alive with memory. The awakening mind began to populate the world with spirit. Every sound of nature became a language, every shadow a sign. Lightning splitting the sky became not just a storm, but communication from beyond. Birth, growth, decay, and death turned into the great cycle, the heartbeat of existence. Humanity had begun to see itself not as separate from the world, but as part of its consciousness, an echo of the same intelligence that moved the tides and lit the stars. This transformation gave rise to art, ritual, and philosophy long before those words existed. Around the same fires that had once been symbols of survival, people began to reenact the stories they imagined. They painted the hunt not to record it, but to honor it, believing that to depict life was to keep it alive. Dance, rhythm, and chant became the first languages of the sacred. Every movement was both expression and invocation. The mind was no longer just observing reality, it was shaping it. With self-awareness came both wonder and fear. To know oneself was to know mortality. The realization of death's permanence haunted and inspired in equal measure. Humans sought answers in the stars, the earth, and within themselves. They created meaning because they had to. Consciousness demanded it. That hunger for understanding became the driving force of civilization, propelling humanity toward discovery, art, and belief. The awakening of the mind was the most profound leap evolution had ever taken. It transformed biology into philosophy, survival into purpose. The world was no longer a mere landscape to live within, it became a mirror reflecting the depths of thought and emotion. And so the first gods were born, shaped not in temples of stone but in the corridors of the human mind. They were thunder and river, sun and shadow, memory and love, manifestations of awareness itself. In creating them, humanity was not reaching outward but inward, naming the forces that already lived within. The dawn of consciousness was the dawn of meaning, and from that light, everything that defines us, faith, art, morality, science, would eventually unfold. The mind had awakened, and the universe would never be silent again. The story of humanity is, above all, a story of movement. From the first sparks of fire in Africa to the farthest reaches of the Pacific, our kind has never stopped walking. The earth itself became our map, and every horizon was a question waiting to be answered. Across the ice, across the oceans, the human tide spread to every shore. Each campfire was a reflection of the first small points of light against the vast darkness, marking the passage of those who carried the flame of our species into the unknown. The Ice Age was both adversary and guide. As the world cooled, glaciers carved the continents into new shapes, revealing paths that had never existed before. Land bridges rose where oceans once divided, connecting Asia to North America, Europe to the frozen tundra of the north. For early humans, these changes were invitations written in frost. They followed herds of mammoth and reindeer, tracking the movement of life through landscapes of wind and silence. With every step, they carried stories, fire, and memory, the invisible tools of civilization. Each migration reshaped humanity. The people who moved through the burning sands of Arabia adapted to the desert's cruel patience. Those who crossed into Europe learned to endure the cold, building shelters from bone and hide, their fires burning against the snow. Along the coasts of Southeast Asia, others became sailors, building rafts and canoes from wood and fiber, daring to cross the unknown expanse of sea. Thousands of years before the first written word, humans had already touched every continent. The world had become their home. The ocean crossings were acts of faith as much as skill. Guided only by stars and the flight of birds, early navigators set out into open water with no promise of land beyond the horizon. Some vanished into the waves. Others found islands so isolated that they became worlds of their own. On the shores of Australia, footprints pressed into ancient sand record one of humanity's earliest arrivals outside Africa. In the highlands of New Guinea and the distant islands of the Pacific, people carried seeds, fire, and language across the endless blue, weaving a web of connection that spanned half the planet. Each migration was more than survival, it was transformation. With every new land came new challenges, and with them, new cultures, new technologies, and new ways of seeing the world. Tools evolved, art flourished, and knowledge spread like wind-borne pollen. Humanity was no longer a single people, but many diverse, adaptable, and deeply intertwined. The same spark that once ignited a single fire in the heart of Africa now burned across the earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical forest. Yet through all this change, something universal endured. No matter where they went, humans gathered around the flame. The fire became a symbol of continuity, the living link between ancestors and descendants. It reminded them of where they came from, a single beginning under a single sky. Though separated by mountains, oceans, and time, every family that sat beneath the stars shared the same origin story. The endless journey was not a march of conquest, but of curiosity. It was driven by the same question that still lives in every heart: what lies beyond? Even now, we carry that impulse in our bones. It is what led our ancestors across deserts and ice sheets, what carried them over oceans, and what now pushes us toward the stars. The journey never truly ended. It simply changed direction. Each campfire that burned along the ancient roads was more than light in the darkness. It was a promise that humanity would keep moving, keep searching, and keep remembering. From the first footprints in African dust to the farthest islands of the Pacific, every step was an echo of that original flame. The earth became the canvas of our story, and the horizon, our eternal invitation. The farther humanity walked, the quieter the world became. Every step into new lands left behind not just footprints, but echoes of the ones who had come before. The planet that had once been shared by many kinds of humans grew lonelier, one by one, as the others disappeared. Yet extinction is never complete, not when memory survives. With every step we took, something ancient fell silent, and yet in every heartbeat, something of them still moves within us. The Neanderthals were among the first to fade. They had endured the frozen heart of Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, surviving ice and famine, crafting tools as fine as our own. But as the climate shifted and new waves of Homo sapiens arrived from the south, their numbers dwindled. It was not war that erased them, but the slow erosion of time, scarcity, and absorption. Some merged into the expanding tide of modern humans, their genes carried forward unseen. The rest became whispers in the caves they once called home, their fire rings buried beneath centuries of dust. The Denisovans vanished more quietly still. Hidden in the high mountains of Asia, they left behind no monuments, no art, only traces in bone and blood. Their legacy endures invisibly, written into the DNA of the people who live closest to the sky. In the lungs of those who breathe the thin air of Tibet, their endurance survives. In the immune systems of Pacific Islanders, their resilience remains. They are gone in body, but alive in function, their strength grafted into ours. Even in Africa, the cradle of beginnings, the vanishing continued. Unknown lineages, older than history, were folded into the growing population of Homo sapiens. Their names are lost, their bones few, but their influence remains. Every human alive carries the imprint of ancestors whose faces will never be known. Each of us is a living archive, a composite of vanished worlds. The cost of survival was silence. As our species expanded, forests fell to fire, the great animals of the Pleistocene disappeared, and entire ecosystems shifted beneath our feet. Life that had thrived for ages yielded to a new kind of force, a creature whose imagination reshaped the planet itself. Humanity did not simply inherit the earth, it began to remake it. And in doing so, it carried both creation and loss. The vanished and the living became inseparable. The traces of those who disappeared are everywhere, if you know where to look. In a child's handprint, on a cave wall. In a fragment of bone beneath a riverbank. In the curve of a skull that no longer fits any known species. Each one is a reminder that we are not a single story, but a chorus of voices layered across time. Our blood is a map of survival. Our cells a gathering place for the ghosts of the past. Every species that vanished gave something to the future. The intelligence of the Neanderthals, the endurance of the Denisovans, the adaptability of the earliest Homo, all flow through us. They shaped how we think, how we move, how we endure. We are not their replacements. We are their continuation. When you breathe, when you speak, when your heart beats beneath your ribs, you are feeling the rhythm that began long before you. The vanished have not truly gone. They live in the curve of our hands, in the patterns of our thoughts, in the light behind our eyes. The world has grown quiet, but their echoes still move within us, reminding us that life does not end with disappearance. It transforms, and through that transformation, it finds eternity. There was never one human story. The path that led to us was not a straight line, but a vast and tangled web, woven across continents and ages. Every generation that walked this planet added its own verse to the song of existence. We are not a single melody, but a chorus, every note, every lineage, every dream that dared to survive. The echo of all blood flows quietly through our veins, linking us not just to our ancestors, but to every being that ever reached for life beneath the same sky. From the first sparks of consciousness in Africa to the footprints pressed into the sands of distant continents, humanity's story has always been one of convergence. We are made of fragments, gathered from countless, forgotten lives. Our DNA carries signatures from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other vanished cousins whose names are lost to time. Their faces have faded, their languages gone, yet their essence endures in the rhythm of our bodies and the structure of our minds. We are walking archives of every triumph and every extinction that came before. The illusion of separateness dissolves when seen from this scale. Every border drawn, every difference we imagine between ourselves is a recent invention, a thin layer atop an ocean of shared origin. The blood that flows through a child in the Arctic once beat in hearts that walked the deserts of Africa. The genes of the highlands carry whispers of the mountains where the Denisovans once thrived. The freckles of Europe and the skin of the equator are both painted by the same artist evolution, endlessly experimenting, endlessly blending. To speak of humanity is to speak of unity disguised as diversity. Every culture, every color, every language is a variation of the same theme: adaptation. Across the millennia, the environment sculpted our differences, but the essence beneath remained the same. The capacity to love, to mourn, to imagine, to build and destroy, all of it came from the same fire that once burned in the first camp beneath the African night. The echo of that fire has never gone out. It merely changed form, moving from flame to heartbeat, from gesture to word, from memory to myth. The science of genetics now confirms what our oldest stories always hinted at. We are one species composed of many pasts. Within each of us lives a multitude, a gathering of the world's entire evolutionary memory condensed into a single form. Our ancestors did not vanish, they became us. The Neanderthal's strength lives in our bones. The Denisovan's breath endures in those who climb mountains without fear of the sky's thin air. Even the most ancient hominins, whose names we will never know, whisper through the proteins that sustain our lives. We are the sum of everything that survived, the inheritors of chance and chaos, of catastrophe and creation. Every heartbeat you feel is part of an unbroken rhythm, stretching back millions of years, a song written in the language of endurance. The echo of all blood is not just history, it is identity. When we look at one another, We are seeing not difference, but reflection. We are the continuation of countless lives that refused to end, that kept walking through ice, through desert, through darkness. The story of humanity was never one of separation, but of connection of blood that learned to remember. And if we listen closely enough, beneath the noise of our age, we can still hear it. The soft, eternal hum of every ancestor who ever lived, singing through us, reminding us that we were never alone. The fire flickers, and for a moment, the line between past and present disappears. The faces illuminated in its glow are not just our own, they are the faces of everyone who ever lived. The first humans were not who we thought. They were not a single tribe, a single species, or a single story. They were everyone. The reflection that stares back through the flame is not one life, but 1,000 lives woven together, an unbroken chain stretching from the first spark of awareness to this very breath. To look into that fire is to look into time itself. You can almost see the shadows moving behind the light, the toolmaker shaping stone in the African dawn, the fire keeper tending embers in a cold cave, the painter pressing a handprint onto rock as if to say, "I was here." They are all still here. Their blood runs in ours. Their thoughts shape the way we think. Their choices built the world we stand upon. Every act of survival, every story told, every dream remembered, has led to this one species. Countless origins. We once believed that history was a ladder, that humanity rose step by step from simplicity to sophistication. But the truth is far more intricate. Our story is not a climb but a convergence, a gathering of branches from a vast tree whose roots reach deep into the earth's ancient soil. The Neanderthal, the Denisovan, the unknown ancestor whose bones crumble in the African dust, they were not competitors or mistakes. They were threads in the same tapestry, each one adding texture and color to the design that would one day become us. What we call modern humanity is only a momentary reflection in a much older mirror. Beneath our skin, within our cells, the past still speaks. It speaks in the strength of our bones, in the resilience of our minds, in the fire that still draws us together under the night sky. When you speak, you carry voices that were first formed in the mouths of people who never saw cities, who named the stars, not from science, but from wonder. When you dream, you revisit the same landscapes they once imagined, the forest, the hunt, the endless horizon. The mind that asks questions today is the same mind that looked up in awe at the stars 200,000 years ago and wondered why. The mirror of origins is not made of glass. It is made of memory, of DNA, of soil, of story. To see ourselves truly, we must look not only at who we are, but at everything we have been. We are the hunters and the gatherers, the painters and the wanderers, the lost and the surviving. Every discovery we make about them is, in truth, a rediscovery of ourselves. And so, as the fire burns lower and the stars turn overhead, the illusion of separation fades. Humanity was never one thing, never one people. It has always been a collective memory, living through countless forms, changing with every generation yet always the same at its core. Curious, creative, and unrelenting. You look into the fire once more, and in its glow, you see not a single reflection, but a gathering, a circle of faces stretching into eternity. The first humans were not who we thought. They were everyone who came before, everyone who walks beside us now, and everyone still to come. The fire of consciousness that began so long ago has not gone out. It burns within us, passed from hand to hand, from dream to dream, and as long as we remember, as long as we imagine, that fire will never fade.